Yo, Mega Maniacs, this is Mr. MegaManFan here to review and talk about Disney classic games Aladdin and The Lion King. This combination of multiple platforms, multiple versions of two classic 1990s platform games from Disney franchises. It was put out in a Nintendo Switch version that I think originally retailed for $30, maybe more. I got it during Black Friday for $15. That was a price that was too good to beat because any of the individual games in here would probably cost you more than that loose. And look at all the extras they pack in. All these interviews, all this extra footage like character art and color guides for how they made it all look. There's a wealth of bonus features in here. They even put the soundtrack, Console S obviously being Sega Genesis, Console N obviously being Super Nintendo, but you can play classic songs like Hakuna Matata, or you can go into the menus and actually play all these different versions. In fact, you can even watch gameplay footage and then stop it and play it right where you want to from the footage itself, which kind of blows my mind. I'm not sure why they didn't think of that for the Genesis collection, like watch gameplay footage, then jump into the game. That is a pretty unique idea, so hats off to the developers on this one. Let me show you a little example of how that works. While we're watching this footage, I'm going to tell you a few facts about the Disney Aladdin game for Sega Genesis. It is the third best-selling game of all time on the Sega Genesis, only behind Sonic the Hedgehog 1 and Sonic the Hedgehog 2. This was a blockbuster hit for both Virgin Games and for Sega. I'm not sure if it's because the movie was just that big. I know that at one point they were actually rushing this game out for release because they wanted to put flyers for the game in VHS copies of the movie. Now, if that doesn't date this, I don't tell you what it is. I mean, shit. Fucking VHS tapes. It's like an episode of Cinemassacre up in here. Cinemassacre movie reviews. But that was the way they marketed this game, and it obviously worked because a lot of people who bought the game were people who probably bought the movie and they were like, oh shit, there's a game too. And I would even go so far as to say this was a console seller for Sega because the game was just that popular and that beloved. It really made a big dent in the video game market in the 90s. But of course, there's also museum footage for Aladdin, just like The Lion King, the making of Aladdin, playing the movie, Digicel color tests, so you can see how they actually animated it to be part of the game. All this interesting extra stuff that you wouldn't get with the games alone. I mean, it's nice to have vintage copies of the original console games, but they're not going to come with these museum interviews and soundtracks and alternate versions. That's what these compilations are for. I'd never played the Game Boy version, so I was really curious about this one. And let me tell you, if you're buying this collection, you're not buying it for this version. You'll play it out of curiosity like I'm doing right now, but look at how janky this is. I mean, okay, they were trying their best. They're trying to do basically a one-to-one port from a 16-bit console to the Game Boy, but there are some things the Game Boy just can't do well, and that many frames of animation, pretty hard to do. The controls are floaty, the graphics are choppy. I mean, you can tell what it's supposed to be. I'm giving them an A for effort, but man, it just feels bad. And I know people like to knock the Castlevania adventure for being really slow, but even for being really slow, it's very well animated and I like how it looks. Whereas this, it moves faster, but moving faster isn't necessarily to its benefit because it's just choppy as hell. Choppy, floaty. The sound is okay. I mean, the Game Boy puts out some pretty quality chiptune music, which is why it's so popular with recording artists, but I just can't recommend this in any way, shape, or form. Especially not compared to the Genesis version where you can have a button to throw, a button to jump, and a button for your weapons. And on the Game Boy, you only got 2 buttons, so you're constantly having to figure out what the heck you're doing with each individual thing. It's a mess. But they tried, God bless them. It was a worthy attempt. But let's go to a much better version. Let's save this. And I will note that as a good feature of this Disney Classics collection, Aladdin and the Lion King, is that you can save your game to a save state and go back to it later. So much like playing on a RetroPie and using save states, or playing it on a Nesticle or SNES 9X type emulator, save states are an option here. So they're thinking about the modern gamer, because back in the days when we got these kind of games, you didn't have save states. You just had to leave your console on all day and pray that nothing overheated. If you had to leave, you put it on pause and you come back later. Can't tell you how many times I did that in my early college days when my roommate and I had a Sega Genesis. I had to go to class, so I'd put it on pause in the middle of a game of Sonic the Hedgehog and leave, and I'd come back and my roommate would be playing NHL 94. I'd be like, dude, I was in the middle of a game. He was like, oh, sorry, thought you were done. I'm like, no, I left it on pause because I wasn't done. But he and I get along still famously to this day, so obviously I didn't hold a grudge over anything like that. It was just one of those things where it's like, you do what you gotta do, because there was no such thing as a save state in 1994. Not on a home console, anyway. Maybe there was an add-on peripheral that gave you save states on a Sega Genesis, but somehow I kinda doubt it. Enough rambling on my part. Let me tell you some more facts about the Sega Genesis version of this game, quoting from the ever-reliable Wikipedia. Development began in January 1993 with a team of 10 animators working on the animation frames, making it look like hand-drawn animation. The work was then shipped to Virgin's California facility to be digitized. The game used traditional animation, which was produced by Disney animators under the supervision of Virgin's animation staff, including animation producer Andy Lucky, technical director Paul Schmidecki, animation director Mike Dietz, and an in-house Digicel process, which I showed you a little of earlier from the museum. Virgin was given the deadline of October 1993 to complete production to coincide with the home video release of the movie, so just as I suspected, they were working on a very tight deadline. The game features some musical arrangements from the film, along with original pieces composed by Donald Griffin and Tommy Tallarico. True fact, one of the first video game conventions I ever went to, I actually met Tommy Tallarico and got an autographed CD from him of some of the in-game music that he composed. Very cool guy. I didn't know he would go on to do the Video Games Live concert series, or that ultimately he would be behind the revival of the Intellivision. Guy's done a lot of stuff over the years, but back then I was just like, dude, you made the music in those Sega Genesis games. You're awesome. I mean, that was pretty much my knowledge of him at the time, was like Aladdin and Earthworm Jim, but I was just so stoked to meet him just because of that. This is the superior version of all versions of Aladdin. This is probably the reason you're buying this compilation. Let's just not beat around the bush or bullshit. This is the one that you want to play if you know Aladdin, if you remember Aladdin. There are some interesting parts of the version for Super Nintendo, though, by comparison. For one, the SNES version was developed by Capcom, not Virgin. And it also has some stylistic differences compared to the Sega Genesis version in the way that you play. For example, in the Sega Genesis version, you wield a scimitar or scimitar, however you pronounce that. In the Super Nintendo version, that is not the case. You don't get this cool ass sword to use, so make your choices wisely. But honestly, you really can't go wrong with the Capcom version because although it didn't sell the gangbusters amount that the Sega Genesis version did, it did pretty respectably for Capcom. Like almost 2 million units sold, putting it on par with like Street Fighter games and selling better than a lot of the Mega Man X games. I hate to admit it, but it's true. So it's not like either of them was a bad game. And don't get me misunderstood and don't start barking at me like, Mr. Mega Man fan, sales does not equal quality. Yeah, I know. If sales equaled quality, then Vanilla Ice's solo debut would have been the best rap album of all time. Just because it sold 10 million copies doesn't mean Vanilla Ice is the world's greatest rapper. But also, conversely, just because some indie rapper sells only 500 copies of his album doesn't mean he's the shits either. Sometimes great things sell great, and sometimes great things don't sell great, and vice versa as well. Hey, Woodtendo, you just became a part of this stream by sending me a friend request while I was reviewing this game, so congratulations to you. And Hawk, you are now also part of this review. Woodtendo and Hawk didn't know they were going to be featured this week on Mr. MegaManFan Reviews Disney Aladdin Classics and The Lion King. But there you are. Speaking of The Lion King, I think we should probably get to testing those games here, shouldn't we? Let's quit out of this and get back to the menu, and then we can try some other things out, just for the sake of all the things that are available. Japanese version. I'm curious now. What's going to be different about the Japanese version of Aladdin compared to the other versions? The opening text is obviously different. And now we're in Agrabah Market. It pretty much looks the same. I don't see any huge differences there. Maybe the levels are a little tougher, but I'm not going to play that far in depth into it to figure that out. Demo version, shown at a trade show in 1993 in Chicago. See if you can spot the differences. Alright, we'll give this a shot before I go play The Lion King. Let's see. Okay, the opening text is definitely different. We're not getting the map that shows all the different things that you can collect, all the different items you can have. And let's look at the gameplay footage. The animation seems a little bit rougher, maybe. I'm noticing not quite as many frames of animation there in Aladdin swinging his scimitar. And the pots were definitely not being dropped on my head that early in the level. Yeah, it's a little bit different. It's not hugely different, but you can tell it was still a work in progress. And the genie wasn't waving his hand at me at that part of the level either, so obviously they decided not to have the genie just stick his head out of a window at that point. So there you go. The demo version of Aladdin. Kind of an interesting inclusion for a compilation such as this. Not normally the type of thing you would think they would want to feature. That's more like the cutting room floor or hidden palace type of material, but they did it, so I got to applaud them for it. That's a nice little bonus on their part. I find it interesting that they don't use the words Sega and Nintendo when they describe these in the compilation. They just use Console S version and Console N version. I wonder if they just didn't want to deal with any possibility they would have to license the names from the respective owners of those trademarks. Though I can't imagine it would have been that much of a hassle. But knowing how litigious Disney can be, I have to think there was some kind of reason behind it. I mean, you try to explain it any other way. I can't think of a good explanation other than that. So, let's talk about The Lion King, the video game. This was developed by Westwood Studios, published by Virgin Interactive for the Super Nintendo and Genesis in 1994, and also ported to, of all things, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Why they would go that far backward, I don't know. The Game Boy, Microsoft Windows, the Commodore Amiga, the Sega Master System, again, kind of a step backward there, and the Game Gear, which is also basically a Sega Master System. The NES Master System and Amiga versions were only released in PAL regions. Well, that makes a little more sense. The NES version in particular being the last game released for the platform in the region, in addition to being the final licensed game for the platform worldwide. The game follows Simba's journey from a young cub to the battle with his evil Uncle Scar as an adult. So, yeah, I can see why they didn't include the Nintendo version or the Sega Master System version. I mean, they could have, for the sake of completeness, Gerard the completionist completeness, but they did include the Japanese version, which I'm going to assume is the Sega Genesis Japanese version, a la the Mega Drive. But as for the ports, there were some interesting decisions made in getting it onto different versions for different consoles. For example, the Amiga 1200 version was developed in 2 months from scratch in assembly language. Now, that's just ridiculous. I can't imagine why you would decide to do it that way, but they did it. The Windows 3.1 version relied on the WinG graphics API, but a series of compact presarios were not tested with WinG, which caused the game to crash while loading. And that was rather infamous at the time because a lot of people bought that compact presario and it came bundled with it for Christmas, and kids were excited that they were going to play The Lion King, and they put it in their computer that they just got for Christmas, and it went right away. So I think there might have even been a class action lawsuit over that. It was a pretty big snafu at the time. In fact, I think I had a compact in college that might have had a similar problem. I don't think it was The Lion King that it took a dump on. I think it might have been like Sonic the Hedgehog or something like that it just wouldn't work with no matter how you had the computer configured. So it is what it is, it was what it was, and it shall be what it shall be. But we do have different versions here. Sega, Nintendo, Japan, Console S or Console N as they like to say. The bottom line is, for $15, you can't go wrong with this compilation if you played Aladdin on the Genesis alone, but with all the extra features, it's well worth it. As always, thanks for watching.